Just enjoy your pie, Emma. I think it's time for you boys to leave.
Maybe you should teach your little girl to mind her own business.
You can leave now. The day those three outlaws walked to Miller's Steakhouse.
I thought it was going to be just another quiet evening with my daughter.
The day those three outlaws walked into Miller's Steakhouse, I thought it was going to be just another quiet evening with my daughter. I couldn't have been more wrong. The restaurant was packed. Ranchers filled the tables. Waitresses moved quickly between crowded aisles. Country music played softly from an old jukebox near the entrance. Emma and I had spent the entire day at a livestock auction selling 2 young horses, and by the time we sat down for dinner, we were both exhausted. Emma was happily working on a slice of apple pie, while I enjoyed the first peaceful moment I'd had all day. That's when I noticed her, Eleanor Whitmore. She was sitting alone across the room. Even if her face hadn't been familiar, everyone in Texas knew the Whitmore name. Owner of the largest ranch in the region. Respected, powerful, successful. She appeared to be waiting for someone. A business meeting, perhaps. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Then the front door opened. The entire atmosphere inside the restaurant changed. 3 men walked in. Nobody greeted them. Nobody smiled. Several conversations stopped immediately. I recognized them. Everyone did. Former ranch hands, known troublemakers, the kind of men who spent more time intimidating people than earning an honest living. They weren't wanted in most places. Yet somehow, trouble always seemed to follow them. Instead of finding a table, they walked directly toward Eleanor. My eyes narrowed. The first man stopped beside her chair. The second blocked the aisle. The third positioned himself near the only open path to the exit. Eleanor remained calm, but I could see the tension in her face. The men started talking, at first quietly, then louder, mocking, provoking, making sure everyone in the restaurant could hear. Nobody moved, nobody intervened. People stared down at their plates. Others pretended not to notice. That's how fear works. Most people convince themselves someone else will step in. No one ever does. I kept watching, studying, listening. One of the men leaned closer to Eleanor. Another laughed. The third slammed a hand onto her table hard enough to make the silverware jump. Still, nobody moved. Then I felt a small hand touch my arm. I looked down. Emma. Her eyes were fixed on the scene across the room. "Dad." That was all she said. She didn't need to say anything else. I looked back toward Eleanor, toward the 3 men, toward the dozens of people silently watching. For several seconds I remained seated, not because I was afraid, because I was calculating, measuring distances, watching hands, looking for weapons, studying intentions. Old habits die hard. Finally, I pushed my chair back, slowly, quietly. The sound seemed louder than the entire restaurant. Emma didn't say a word. She already knew. I stood up, adjusted my hat, and started walking toward Eleanor's table. At that moment, nobody inside that restaurant had the slightest idea who the quiet cowboy crossing the room really was. And neither did the 3 men who had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. My name is Jacob Miller. I'm 42 years old, and if you asked most people in town who I am, they'd probably give you a simple answer. A cowboy, a widower, a single father trying to keep a small ranch alive. And honestly, they'd be right. Most days, my life isn't very exciting. I wake up before sunrise, feed the horses, repair fences, move cattle, fix whatever decides to break that morning. Then I do it all again the next day. My ranch isn't large. It's nothing like the sprawling properties owned by families like the Whitmores. I've got a few horses, a handful of cattle, an aging truck that complains every time I turn the key, and enough debt to remind me that ranching has never been an easy way to make a living. But every time I start worrying about money, I remember why I keep going. Emma. My daughter is 8 years old. She's brave, stubborn, kind, and completely in love with horses. Most afternoons I'll find her somewhere in the pasture, talking to them as if they're old friends. The strange thing is, they seem to listen. Emma got her courage from her mother. Sarah never backed down from doing what she believed was right, even when it would have been easier to stay silent, even when nobody else agreed with her. That was one of the things I admired most about her. Years ago, before she passed away, she told me something I've never forgotten. The strongest people are usually the quietest. At the time, I didn't fully understand what she meant. I thought strength was about winning arguments, being tougher than everyone else, proving people wrong. Sarah saw things differently. She believed real strength was staying calm when everyone around you was losing control. It was showing kindness when anger would have been easier. It was helping someone even when there was nothing to gain. Over the years, I learned she was right. Life has a way of teaching lessons you aren't ready for. After losing Sarah, I had every reason to become bitter, every reason to be angry. Instead, I focused on Emma. I focused on building a life she could be proud of. That's why I learned to avoid unnecessary conflict, not because I was afraid of it, because most conflicts aren't worth the damage they leave behind. I've seen enough fights to know that. Most problems can be solved with patience. Most arguments disappear if you refuse to feed them. Most angry people eventually calm down if someone stays level-headed. So whenever possible, I walk away. I stay quiet. I mind my own business. People often mistake that for weakness. They're usually wrong, because there is one thing I will never walk away from: someone who needs help. If an animal is hurt, I stop. If a neighbor's truck is stranded, I stop. If someone is being treated unfairly, I stop. Sarah taught me that too, and Emma watches everything I do. Children learn more from examples than words. The man she sees today is the man she'll use to judge every other man she meets someday. That responsibility matters more to me than anything, which is exactly why I stood up in that restaurant. Not because Eleanor Whitmore owned the largest ranch in the region, not because she was powerful, not because she was wealthy. If those 3 men had cornered a school teacher, a waitress, or a complete stranger, I would have done the same thing. To me, she was simply someone who needed help. What I didn't realize was that my decision to stand up that evening was about to change everything. Because while most people in that restaurant saw an ordinary cowboy walking toward trouble, Eleanor Whitmore was about to discover there was far more to Jacob Miller than anyone could possibly imagine. And at that moment, she still knew absolutely nothing about my past. The moment I stood up from my table, the entire restaurant seemed to grow quieter. Not silent, just quieter, like everyone sensed something was about to happen. I walked calmly toward Eleanor's table. No hurry, no anger, no dramatic gestures. The 3 men were too focused on intimidating her to notice me at first. One of them had both hands planted on the table. Another blocked the aisle. The third leaned against a nearby chair with a grin that suggested he was enjoying every second of it. Eleanor saw me approaching before they did. For a brief moment, our eyes met. She looked surprised, not because I was there, because I was walking directly toward trouble. Finally, one of the men turned around. His smile disappeared. "What do you want, cowboy?" I stopped beside Eleanor's table, close enough to protect her if necessary, far enough to avoid looking threatening. Then I spoke, calmly, politely. "I think it's time for you boys to leave." The restaurant became completely silent. A waitress froze halfway through taking an order. Several ranchers stopped eating. Even the music from the jukebox seemed distant. Then the men started laughing. The first one shook his head. "You hear that? The cowboy wants us to leave." The others laughed harder. I didn't react. The second man looked me up and down. "Weren't you sitting over there eating pie with your little girl?" I remained silent. The third man smiled. "Maybe you should go back before something happens." Still nothing. No threats, no insults, no anger. Years ago I learned something important. The loudest man in a confrontation is rarely the most dangerous. The first outlaw stepped closer. "You think you're some kind of hero?" "No." "Then why are you here?" I glanced briefly toward Eleanor, then back at him. "Because she asked you to stop." His smile vanished. He didn't like that answer. None of them did. The second man decided to try something else. He looked across the room toward Emma. She was sitting exactly where I had left her, watching everything. His expression changed. "You should be teaching your daughter to mind her own business." That got my attention. Not because I was angry, because he had made a mistake, a serious one. I slowly looked at him, then at Emma, then back at him. The restaurant felt tense enough to snap. Even Eleanor seemed to realize the atmosphere had changed. The men noticed it too. But instead of backing down, they pushed harder. The first outlaw stepped directly into my space, chest to chest, trying to provoke a reaction, trying to make me lose control. I didn't move. Then he shoved me. Not hard, just enough to start a fight. At least that's what he expected. What happened next lasted only a few seconds. The moment his hands touched me, I shifted slightly to the side. His momentum carried him forward. I controlled his wrist, redirected his balance, and guided him harmlessly into an empty chair. The chair tipped backward. The outlaw hit the floor. The entire restaurant gasped. Before the other two could react, I positioned myself between them and Eleanor, not aggressively, not violently, simply in control. The second man raised his fists, then hesitated, because he suddenly realized something. This wasn't luck. The third outlaw looked at his friend on the floor, then back at me. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. They had expected anger. They had expected a brawl. Instead, they found discipline, control, training, the kind that comes from years of experience, not from bar fights. The first outlaw slowly stood, embarrassed, humiliated, but no longer confident. I adjusted my hat, looked at all three men, and spoke in the same calm voice I had used from the beginning. "You can leave now." This time, nobody laughed. A few seconds later they turned and walked out of the restaurant. Without another word, the front door closed behind them. Only then did the room begin breathing again. Conversations slowly returned. People started moving. The tension finally released. Across the table, Eleanor continued staring at me. Not frightened, not confused. Curious, very curious, because she had just watched a quiet cowboy handle three dangerous men without losing his temper once. And in that moment, she realized something immediately. Jacob Miller was not an ordinary cowboy. The incident at the restaurant spread across town faster than a summer wildfire. By the next morning, everyone seemed to have their own version of the story. Some claimed I had fought all three men at once. Others insisted I had thrown them through tables. A few even added details that would have been impressive if they weren't completely invented. The truth was far less dramatic. I had simply prevented a bad situation from becoming worse. Then I went back to my ranch and returned to work. As far as I was concerned, the matter was finished. For Eleanor Whitmore, however, it was only beginning. A few days later, she started asking questions. Not publicly, not in a way anyone would notice. She simply became curious. Most people who witnessed that confrontation had focused on what happened. Eleanor focused on how it happened. The calmness, The discipline, the control. 3 aggressive men had tried to provoke me, and somehow I never lost my temper. That wasn't normal, at least not for most people. Eventually, her questions led her to Sheriff Harper. The sheriff had known me for years. At first, he refused to discuss my past. But small towns have a way of revealing truths when enough people start asking the same questions. And little by little, Eleanor learned who I had once been. Not just a cowboy, not just a rancher. Years before returning to ranch life, I had worn a different badge. I was a Texas Ranger. For nearly a decade, I investigated violent crimes, tracked fugitives across multiple states, worked alongside federal agencies, spent countless nights following leads that most people never heard about. Some of the men I arrested had spent years running from the law. Others believed they were too dangerous to be caught. Most eventually learned they were wrong. The work demanded patience, observation, discipline, the ability to remain calm when everyone around you was losing control. Those skills don't disappear simply because you leave the job. When Eleanor discovered all of that, she was stunned. Not because of the badge, because I had never mentioned it, not once. The next time she visited my ranch, she finally asked, "You were a Texas Ranger?" I looked up from the fence I was repairing. "I was." She folded her arms. "And you never thought that was worth mentioning?" I laughed softly. Not really. Her expression made it clear she found that answer ridiculous. "Jacob, most people would talk about that every chance they got." "Maybe. But I'm not most people." She shook her head. "You captured fugitives. You investigated criminals. You carried a badge." I drove another nail into the fence post before answering. "That was a long time ago." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she asked the question that mattered. "Why did you leave?" The smile disappeared from my face, not because I didn't know the answer, because I knew it too well. "Sarah." Just one word. That was enough. Eleanor immediately understood. After losing my wife, the things that once seemed important no longer felt that way. I was tired of violence, tired of danger, tired of spending weeks away from home. Most of all, I was tired of missing moments with Emma. When Sarah died, I realized something. My daughter didn't need a Texas Ranger. She needed her father. So I left, bought a small ranch, started over, and never looked back. Meanwhile, something unexpected was happening. Emma and Noah had become inseparable. The first time they met, they spent hours talking about horses. Now they acted as though they had known each other forever. They rode together, explored trails together, shared stories during dinner. Noah laughed more around Emma than anyone had seen in years. Emma adored having a friend who loved ranch life as much as she did. One afternoon I watched them race across a pasture while Eleanor stood beside me. "They look like brother and sister." She smiled. I was thinking the same thing. For a moment, everything felt peaceful, simple, the kind of happiness that arrives quietly. Unfortunately, not everyone was ready to let that happiness continue, because somewhere else in town, 3 humiliated men were still remembering what happened inside that restaurant. And unlike Eleanor, they weren't curious about my past. They were angry because of it, and they had no intention of forgetting what happened that night. I should have known the story wasn't over. Men like those 3 outlaws rarely walk away from humiliation without wanting revenge. For a few weeks after the restaurant incident, everything seemed normal. The Whitmore Ranch was peaceful. Emma and Noah spent nearly every weekend together. Life settled back into its familiar rhythm. Then the problems started. At first, they were small, easy to dismiss. A gate left open during the night. A section of fencing cut instead of broken. Tools disappearing from the equipment shed and later reappearing in strange places. Most ranchers would have blamed bad luck. I didn't. Years as a Texas Ranger taught me that accidents usually happen once. Patterns happen for a reason. The more I looked, the more obvious it became. Someone was testing boundaries, watching, waiting. One morning I discovered fresh tire tracks near the northern pasture. Nobody had permission to be there. A few days later, one of my horses was found wandering nearly 2 miles from where it should have been. The latch on the gate had been deliberately tampered with. Then things escalated. A water line supplying one of the cattle fields was cut during the night. Another week later, someone smashed the headlights on my truck while it sat parked outside the barn. Whoever was responsible wanted me to notice. They wanted me uncomfortable, maybe even frightened. Unfortunately for them, fear isn't very useful when you've spent years tracking dangerous people for a living. I began documenting everything: photographs, dates, footprints, vehicle tracks, security camera footage from neighboring properties. The evidence slowly started forming a picture, and that picture led directly back to the 3 men from the restaurant. The same 3 men I had embarrassed in front of half the county. Only now they weren't acting alone. The deeper I investigated, the more one name kept appearing. Victor Kane, rich, powerful, connected. For years, people assumed Eleanor would eventually marry him. Victor certainly behaved as though that outcome was guaranteed. Then I arrived, not looking for money, not looking for influence, simply existing. And somehow that was enough to threaten everything he wanted. The 3 outlaws had become his tools, his intimidation squad, his way of applying pressure while keeping his own hands clean. One former employee eventually admitted seeing them meeting privately on Victor's property. Another ranch hand reported hearing conversations about getting rid of the cowboy. None of it was enough to make an arrest. But it was enough for me to understand the plan. Victor didn't necessarily want to hurt me. He wanted Eleanor to believe being around me created problems. If the threats continued long enough, perhaps she'd decide I wasn't worth the trouble. The problem with that strategy was simple. He underestimated how stubborn both Eleanor and I could be. One evening, after finishing repairs at the Whitmore Ranch, I stayed late reviewing security footage from several cameras recently installed around the property. Hours passed. Most of the recordings showed nothing unusual. Then I found it. A truck, parked near one of the service roads after midnight. 3 familiar silhouettes stepping out. The same men, the same troublemakers. The timestamp matched the night several storage buildings had been vandalized. Finally, something concrete. I thought that would be the most disturbing thing I found. I was wrong. Near the end of the recording, one of the men approached the camera. He didn't know it was recording audio, but it was. His voice came through clearly. The others laughed as he spoke. Then he said a sentence that made my blood run cold. Maybe the little girl needs to understand what happens when her daddy doesn't stay out of business. That doesn't belong to him. For a moment, I simply stared at the screen. My hands tightened into fists. Not from anger, from certainty. This had just become something very different. Because threats against me were one thing, threats against Emma were something else entirely. And at that moment, I knew the next move wouldn't be about protecting my ranch. It would be about protecting my daughter. The meeting was held inside the largest livestock pavilion in the county. By sunset, the place was packed. Ranch owners, employees, local business leaders, members of the Whitmore Ranch Board, families from town, even people who rarely attended public meetings showed up. Word had spread quickly. Everyone knew something important was about to happen. Sheriff Harper stood near the front of the room alongside several deputies. Eleanor sat beside the board members. Victor Kane occupied a seat near the center aisle, looking as confident as ever. If he felt nervous, he hid it well. The 3 men who had harassed Eleanor at the restaurant weren't there, at least not yet. I arrived carrying a single box. Nothing dramatic, just evidence. Months of lies have a way of collapsing under the weight of facts. When the meeting began, Victor was the first to speak. He presented himself as a concerned businessman, a loyal partner, a protector of local jobs. He claimed the recent accusations against him were nothing more than misunderstandings. Several people nodded. Others looked uncertain. Then Sheriff Harper called my name. I walked to the front of the room, set the box on the table, and opened it. The room became completely silent. I started with the simplest evidence: photographs, security footage, vehicle registrations. The images showed Victor's employees meeting privately with the 3 outlaws multiple times over several weeks. Then came financial records, bank transfers, payments routed through shell companies, consulting fees that never corresponded to actual work. Every road eventually led back to Victor Kane. The more documents I revealed, the quieter the crowd became. Then I played the security footage from the Whitmore Ranch. The same footage showing the 3 men trespassing, damaging equipment, cutting fences, tampering with property. Several ranch employees immediately identified them. The evidence alone was powerful, but it wasn't enough. Then came the witnesses. A former employee testified that Victor had offered cash payments for information about ranch operations. Another admitted he had been instructed to spread rumors about me throughout the county. A third witness revealed that Victor's associates had discussed creating enough instability around Eleanor that board members might eventually support, transferring portions of operational control to outside investors. Investors controlled by Victor. The room erupted into whispers. For the first time all evening, Victor looked uncomfortable. Then Sheriff Harper introduced the final piece of evidence. One of the 3 outlaws, facing criminal charges, cooperating in exchange for a reduced sentence. The man entered the room visibly nervous. He avoided looking at Victor. Then he told the truth, every bit of it. The payments, the threats, the intimidation, the vandalism, the orders. Victor had financed everything, not because he needed money, because he wanted power, control, the Whitmore Ranch, and if destroying a few lives helped him achieve that goal, he was willing to do it. The silence afterward felt heavier than any argument. Victor slowly stood, tried to deny everything, but even he knew it was over. The evidence was overwhelming. Sheriff Harper stepped forward. 2 deputies moved beside him. Victor looked around the room, searching for support. He found none. Moments later, he was escorted out in handcuffs. The same man who had spent years believing he could control everyone around him left the building as a criminal. The crowd watched in complete silence. The 3 outlaws were arrested that same evening. Formal charges followed. The investigation expanded. Several fraudulent business arrangements connected to Victor's companies were frozen. For the first time in months, the Whitmore Ranch was safe. Its employees were safe. Its future was secure. As people slowly began leaving the pavilion, Eleanor approached me. There were tears in her eyes. Not tears of fear, relief, gratitude, peace. "You saved the ranch." I shook my head. "No." The truth did. She smiled. The same smile I had first seen beside that broken wagon. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. The battle was over. The danger was gone. And suddenly I realized something. My work here was finished. The ranch no longer needed protecting. Victor was gone. The threats were over. The people I cared about were safe. That night, as I loaded my toolbox into the back of my truck, I made a decision. It was time to go home, back to my small ranch, back to the simple life Emma and I had always known. What I didn't realize was that someone wasn't ready to let me leave quite so easily. 3 days after Victor Kane was arrested, life finally began to feel normal again. The headlines disappeared, the rumors stopped, the endless meetings came to an end. For the first time in weeks, I woke up to nothing more complicated than feeding horses and repairing fences. Honestly, that was exactly how I liked it. Emma and I returned to our little ranch and settled back into our routine. Sunrise chores, long afternoons in the pasture, quiet evenings on the porch. The kind of life that never makes the news but somehow means everything. I was repairing an old gate near the barn. One afternoon when I heard the sound of a vehicle approaching, I looked up. A familiar truck rolled slowly into the driveway. A few seconds later, Eleanor Whitmore stepped out. She wasn't dressed like the owner of one of the largest ranches in Texas. No business jacket, no formal meeting, just jeans, boots, and a simple smile. The kind of smile people wear when they finally feel at peace. I set my tools down. "What brings you all the way out here?" She laughed softly. "I think I owe you a proper thank you." I shook my head. "You don't owe me anything. That's where you're wrong." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The Texas breeze moved gently through the grass around us. Then Eleanor looked toward the barn where Emma was brushing one of the horses. "Thank you for protecting us." She paused. "For protecting Noah. For protecting the ranch. And for doing the right thing when nobody else would." I smiled. I just did what needed to be done. She looked at me carefully, the way people do when they're trying to understand something that doesn't make sense. Finally, she asked the question she'd clearly been carrying for days. "Why didn't you tell me who you really were?" I already knew what she meant. The Texas Ranger badge, the investigations, the years spent tracking fugitives, the parts of my life most people found impressive. I couldn't help smiling. Then I looked toward Emma. She was laughing with one of the horses, completely unaware that she was the answer to Eleanor's question, because being Emma's dad matters more. For a moment, Eleanor simply stared at me. Then her eyes softened, as though she finally understood. The badge had never been the most important part of my life. Neither were the arrests, or the cases, or the stories people liked to tell. Those things belonged to another chapter. The chapter that mattered now was standing beside that horse, holding a brush, laughing at something only a child could find funny. A few minutes later, another truck arrived. Noah jumped out before it had even stopped moving. "Emma?" Emma immediately ran toward him. The two children disappeared into the pasture within seconds. Neither cared about investigations, or criminals, or ranch politics. They cared about horses, adventures, and spending time together. Watching them race through the fields felt strangely familiar, almost like watching a brother and sister who didn't yet realize how much they meant to each other. As the afternoon slowly turned into evening, the four of us walked toward the western pasture. The sky glowed with deep shades of orange and gold. The horses grazed peacefully. The world felt quiet again, complete. Emma and Noah ran ahead, chasing each other through the tall grass, while laughing so hard they could barely stay on their feet. Eleanor stood beside me. Neither of us felt the need to fill the silence. Sometimes the best moments don't require words. They simply require the right people. As the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, I looked toward the children, then toward the ranches stretching across the Texas countryside. And I realized something. The day those outlaws walked into that restaurant, everyone thought a cowboy stood up. But the truth is, a father stood up, and I'd do it again every single time. If you had been sitting in that restaurant, would you have stood up to help someone in trouble? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about courage, family, second chances, and cowboys who never give up, subscribe to the channel and join us for the next story.